We'll start. So good morning, one and all. I welcome you all to this 6th day of the online classes for 3rd semester MA, being conducted MA in English, being organized jointly by Vasanthrao Naik Government Institute of Arts and Social Sciences, Nagpur, Rajkumar Keval Ramani Mahila Mahavidyalaya, Kanya Mahavidyalaya, Jaripatka, and J.M. Patel, Arts, Commerce and Science College, Bhandara. The topic for the session is the critical writings of William Wordsworth and S.T. Coleridge. And the resource person for the day, for the session is Dr. Savita Deogirkar. Ma'am at present is working as associate professor at VMV College, Vardhaman Nagar, Nagpur. She has completed her doctoral research way back in 2013 at Sant Gadge Baba Amravati University. And the topic of her research was African American psyche as revealed in the dramas of August Wilson. She got through her set in the year 1998 and was 8th in the order of merit when in PG as well as in UG, in her master's as well as undergraduate. She has experience of more than 20 years, and she started her career with as an assistant professor at AMV College, Dhamangao Railway, and later joined VMV. She has authored about 3 books and prelude a textbook of college students. That is the one, a handbook of literary terms, I think, along with our friend present here, Karthik Panikar, that book, and Poetry in Quarantine, yeah, her latest publication. Then she has several research articles and papers to her credit, more than 20, around 24, and she has participated in the professional trainings along and is always on the look for professional upgradation. So on behalf of the organizing colleges and the participating students, I welcome ma'am to this session and hand over the mic to her for her presentation. Over to you, Savita ma'am.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Kapil sir. At the outset, I thank the collaborative colleges, organizing committees, organizing teams of different colleges of the town, that they gave me this opportunity to have a tete-a-tete with my PG students so far throughout the vicinity, out of the city as well, because
study of morphological adaptation of animal.
Excuse me, Savita. Please keep your mics on silent
Found
mode.
in.
Please mute your mics. Students.
Found in.
Rupali Gabne. Juhi Behal Pade. Please.
Kajal Nevare, Shrutika, mute your mic.
Yeah, should we start?
Yeah.
I mean, the organizing committee members.
Yeah.
Organizing committee members want me to talk. The students are not allowed to talk right now. Let me have my presentation at first, and the session will be open for discussion later on. Okay, and at that point of time, you will be given full freedom to talk to me. Before that, I request all of you to keep muted yourselves so that I can deliberate on my topic today. Okay. At the outset, I thank all the organizing committee members and different colleges in collaboration who have wonderfully organized this online lecture series, particularly talking about literary criticism, one of the very crucial and very important papers of PG students. I mean, since last couple of years, when we delve deep into this literary criticism, believe me, nobody has mastered even today. Because literary criticism, when we talk about theory, when we talk about literary criticism, you see, we have to keep reading. Otherwise, we tend to forget. Most of the times, these literary theories are obsolete by the passage of time. And that's the sole reason why we need to keep on reading these literary theories and the application of these theories into literary criticism. So far, I wish to deal with one of the very favorite ages of literary criticism, or you may say literature of English literature, none other than Romantic period, Romantic age. Before I go on for my presentation today, I wish to share my screen with all of you all so that we can start in a very streamlined, disciplined manner. Okay, I hope you are able to see my screen. Again, I request all of you to mute yourselves so that there won't be any disturbance. I request the organizers, please mute others. Please.
Kapil, you can mute them at your end because you are the admin.
It's quite a disturbance to me.
Yeah, Sunita Ghate.
Can you please mute yourselves, dear friends? Well, thank you. Thank you so very much. Now I am into my presentation. Well, talking about Romantic age, or particularly focusing my attention today on Romantic criticism, I have not exactly tried to, deal holistically two of the important critical critiques on Romantic age, talking particularly about the one and only, just like other critics like Aristotle, Longinus, and in the line of these two great critics, we always place S.T. Coleridge, the third one. Okay, but when we talk about these critics who are hailing from Romantic age, Romantic period, none other than William Wordsworth and S.T. Coleridge, I am not trying to consider the whole of the critics seminal works of criticism by S.T. Coleridge and William Wordsworth. But yes, I would try to deliberate on some very pertinent issues which were covered by these two great critics of Romantic age, none other than William Wordsworth and S.T. Coleridge. Talking about poetry, talking about the poet, or the definition of a poem, the prerequisite of meter into the poetic language, the aim of the poem or the aim of the poet, the characteristics of the poet, or you may say the qualifications of the poets. When we talk about all these things, imagination, particularly talking about when it comes to S.T. Coleridge, we are of course trying to delve deep into one of the very crucial points of deliberation here we are talking about, and that is Romantic criticism. Do not forget, when we talk about Romantic criticism, this is the outline of my presentation today for a while. First part of my lecture would be focusing on Preface to Lyrical Ballads, which was written by William Wordsworth in the year 1802. Not exactly 1802. He wrote this Preface to Lyrical Ballads as an advertisement in 1798. Okay, and later on, he tried to revise it in 1802. He kept revising this preface somehow because previously William Wordsworth did not want to write this preface to Lyrical Ballads, but then he thought that it is necessary on the part of the poet to talk about the kind of way apart from the league of classical tradition, or you may say neoclassical age, wherein people or the critics or the poets were having all the rules at the back of their mind. They were abiding with the kind of rules, the ancient regime they call it. Okay, now when we talk about the first part of my lecture, I would be of course talking about the nature, qualification and the function of a poet. Later, I'll talk on the poetic pleasure, the process of poetic creation, which has been wonderfully given or excellently given to the world by William Wordsworth when he talks about his the very famous quote, very famous definition of a poem, where he says poetry is a spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings, recollected in tranquility. We are talking about this process of poetic creation here. Then he talks about meter. He justifies his claim that there is an importance of meter to be indulged, to be invested while writing poetry. My second part of the lecture is completely focused on Biographia Literaria, one of the very crucial, seminal, critical piece of argument by S.T. Coleridge, who published this book in 2 volumes in 1817. In this critical discourse, the poet critic and the philosopher, S.T. Coleridge, talks about the poet, poetry, and one of the greatest contributions on the part of a critic, S.T. Coleridge, none other than his discourse on imagination. Okay. Then he talks about fancy later on, and he makes it very clear that it should not be synonymous. I mean, he desynonymizes imagination from fancy. And the last part of my lecture would be focusing on the willing suspension of disbelief. That is the known definition, or you may say the function of poetry on the part of S.T. Coleridge when he talks about willing suspension of disbelief. And finally, we will head on to the last part of my lecture, that is his justification, S.T. Coleridge's justification about the indulgence of poetic diction or meter, and the challenge which he gives to William Wordsworth when he talks about criticizing Wordsworth. You may say the ideas of Wordsworth or the ideals of Wordsworth, making of Wordsworth, you may say, in other words, when he talks about the justification of meter, justification of poetic diction. He says that there is an essential difference between the language of poetry and the language of prose. You cannot treat both of them equally. I mean, the language of poetry must differ with the language of prose. There we are about to end my lecture. So this is the outline of my lecture. I'll come back to my, comprise a complete, encompass the complete text of William Wordsworth's Preface to Lyrical Ballads as well as Biographia Literaria, because keeping in view the short duration given to me, we are actually running short of time, because in 1.5 hours, it's not possible to talk about Preface to Lyrical Ballads as well as Biographia Literaria. But let us hope that I will be, considering, I will be arguing on one of the most important, which have been, given weightage in these 2 seminal works of these 2 poets come critics of the Romantic era. So I think this is clear in all of your mind. Okay. Heading onwards to the next one. Wait a minute. Talking about the next topic, before we start exactly deliberating on the critical, you all to understand there are some, romantic age before we arrive to the romantic revival, romantic movement, there are some pertinent issues which were considered to be political events, which were considered to be ideological events, which were considered to be socio-political and economical events which took place in the whole of the continent of Europe, none other than Industrial Revolution, which took place in 1760s, right? And when we talk about Industrial Revolution, of course, at that point of time in 1760s, people gave full weightage to machines. Machines replaced human beings. That was very important revolution. That was a very important economical event which took place in 1760s. Later on, when we step into American Revolution, don't forget that there were 13 counties which were liberating themselves from British Empire, and this was American Revolution, which was literally ideological in sense and political. If we talk about holistic idea of this American Revolution. When we talk about American Revolution, we have to consider that the people of the other continent, America, they were talking about human beings and the freedom, free will, which was on the top of the horizon. They considered individuals as the prime most concern of every other thing. I mean, human beings or the individualism was propagated through this ideological and political event, none other than American Revolution. 13 counties got freed from the clutches of British Empire, and they believed that there was individualism at the core of everybody's heart, and that is to be preserved, that is to be given full weightage, that is to be put on top priority. Then we head on to the French Revolution, which took place in 1789. Almost all of you who have learned romantic poetry, who have learned romantic revival, romantic movement, they know this background, because unless and until you understand this background, you cannot go into the deliberation of these critical discourses, justified or propagated by William Wordsworth and S.C. Coleridge. French Revolution, this was, of course, a socio-political event which took place in France, which mostly talks about liberty, equality, and fraternity. These were the ideals which were given to the world by French Revolution. When we talk about liberty, we are talking about free will here, okay? Equality, men are equal to each other. There should not be any racism. There should not be any class and caste divide. So these were the ideals which were given to the world by French Revolution. Of course, in France, this French Revolution or the ideals of French Revolution were completely nullified later on with the rise of Napoleon Bonaparte. We are not going into all these things because this background, which is very important, which would make you comfortably ready to accept what happens next, right? When we talk about romantic age, some of the critics of the world, or almost all the students of literature, they believe that it was a reaction. Of course, it is a reaction against classical restraint and obsession with reason. Why? Because French Revolution is at the back of your mind, wherein feudal system was completely destroyed. That is known to all of us. Now, this romantic revival is always neoclassicism follows romantic revival. When we talk about neoclassicism, it can be called as pseudo-classicism as well. It can be called as Augustan criticism as well. What happened to this pseudo-classical period? Most of these poets who were writing their poetry, they went back, they revisited, I must say, the classical age. They revived classical age, which was strictly talking about abiding the rules and regulations. And they believed that poetry is for instruction, right? So that was the idea which was to be, denied, refuted by this romantic age, by this romantic revival, by this romantic criticism. And that's why romantic age or romantic movement is generally regarded as a reaction against classical restraint and obsession with reason. Then some of the people or some of the literary students, the lovers of literature, they treat this romantic age as the counter-enlightenment. Because if you remember Kant and all, they were talking about enlightenment, which took place in Germany and France, okay, parallelly. What was this enlightenment all about? Science was on the top of the world. I mean, they believe that everything is scientific there. And this was, and when we consider science at the top of the world, or science to be given full weightage, here some of the people, those who were believing in humanity, those who were believing in emotions, feelings, those who were believing in individualism, they refuted this idea as well. And through this romantic age, they refuted these ideas. And that's why romantic age is also called as counter-enlightenment. Well, romantic age has its roots, you may say, in this German movement, which is called as Sturm-und-Drang. Sturm-und-Drang was a German movement which took place in Germany. Okay, at the same time, there was Victor Hugo in France. There were, some people from America, none other than the greatest poets like Walter Whitman, then Edgar Allan Poe. They were also talking about storm and stress. Actually speaking, Sturm und Drang, that is the German movement, which often talks about storm and stress. So to cope up with the storm and stress, individuality was given weightage. Okay. Now, this was actually romantic age. Romantic movement has its roots from this German movement. Okay. And now we are all ready for receiving a preface to Lyrical Ballads, okay, and Biographia Literaria by S.T. Coleridge. So we have to have all these issues and events at the back of our mind when we talk about these two critics which were given to the world by the poets, basically, born poets, William Wordsworth and S.T. Coleridge. We are talking about the first generation poets here, first generation romantic poets here. They are not only the poets, but the critics as well. That is known to all of you all, right? Now, when we talk about Preface to Lyrical Ballads and Biographia Literaria, these are the important events which took place at the backdrop. And now we are all ready to go for William Wordsworth's Preface to Lyrical Ballads. Yeah. When we talk about Preface to Lyrical Ballads, I have already stated that most of the points of deliberation on the part of William Wordsworth, he kept revising it. Why there was a need of preface? If we think about it, we come to know that this was the period which was actually opposing neoclassical tradition. Now, this neoclassical tradition is, of course, talking about ancient regime, which was strictly following the rules and regulations, okay? Now, all of a sudden, if a particular poet comes up with a different type of a poem or poetry, okay, holistically speaking about the idea of poetry by William Wordsworth, we have to understand that this was completely different. William Wordsworth kept at the back of his mind individual. He talks about a person, an individual who is common to a layman, okay? And that's the sole reason he thought that there is a requirement of an introduction to his poetry through this preface. much before Wordsworth, you would say, the poets like, it was not William Wordsworth only who was, trying to oppose the ideas of neoclassical tradition. In league with William Wordsworth, there were some poets like Robert Burns, for that matter, William Collins, Blake. They also deviated from the neoclassical insistence on rules, okay? And William Wordsworth was the actually only poet who made his poetic experiences the locus of his critical discourse through this preface to Lyrical Ballads. Now, this became the locus of his critical discourse. Why there was a need of this introductory prefatory argument? You have to consider it that there was a kind of, there was a kind of unraveling of the workings of the mind of the poet, which was to be conveyed, to the masses, to the society, because the society was not akin to this kind of poetry, which was about to be published by these collaborative poets, none other than William Wordsworth and S.T. Coleridge, through Lyrical Ballads. Okay, that was a collaboration of these two great poets of romantic, first generation romantic poets, Lyrical Ballads. And for that reason, there was a necessity on the part of the poet to introduce his poetry on which topic he is going to talk on, what will be considered, why this has been a different realm of poetry altogether. That was the sole idea when he wrote this preface. Previously, it was an advertisement, and later on in 1802, which has been considered to be the standard, deliberation on critical discourse on the part of William Wordsworth. We generally take it as the standard copy of, preface, which was published in 1802. Later on, he kept revising this preface, and in 1815 it became an appendix, completely a different essay altogether, which was introduced in 1815 by William Wordsworth. Anyway, talking about preface to Lyrical Ballads, the poet is talking about the unraveling of the workings of the mind of the poet. Okay, the poet's mind generates emotions, according to the poet, and feelings so intense and passionate that transmits into poetic experience, with forms the basis of his poetic composition. Preface is actually believed to be a poetic manifesto. When we talk about preface to Lyrical Ballads, one of the key words here, which is used by William Wordsworth, is spontaneity, and this spontaneity is a desirable characteristic for the poet. When he talks about his poetry, when he talks about the definition of a poem, when he talks about the poet's definition, he defines a poet in a different manner. He says a poet is essentially a man speaking to men. That is his idea of a poet. When he talks about this idea, when he says a poet is essentially a man speaking to men, he is talking about a layman here. Okay, a man who is just like us, who belongs to a common lot. I mean, he is an individual who is essentially a man speaking to men. And when he tries to communicate through his poetry, of course, he is talking about that language, okay, which would be spoken by commoners, right? To choose incidents and situations from common life. That was again the purpose of preface. Why he wrote this preface? Because he was picking the incidents and situations from the common life. For example, you may consider any of the poems written by William Wordsworth so far, which got published through Lyrical Ballads. You may take the example of Solitary Reaper for that matter. You may take the example of Daffodils here. The small incidents which are taken from common life. Okay. Now, if these incidents and situations are taken from common life, we have to consider the common language used by the commoners, isn't it? But then he felt his poems were different in themes and style. And that was the sole reason why there is a requirement. See the themes. The themes were taken from rustic and humble life. These were the themes of the poetry of William Wordsworth. They were taken from rustic and humble life. I mean, the language used by the farmers, the language used by the rustics, the language used by the laymen, the language used by the commoners, that would be given weightage. That would be given importance through his poetry. And that was the purpose of preface. Previously, no other poet before Romantic age, I mean to say, no poet dared to speak about the language of the commoners here. They never talked about the rustic and humble life. No poet dared to pick the incidents and situations which were commonly experienced by all of us. By all of us, right? So that was the necessity. That was the necessity why, with this introduction, the poet wanted to introduce his poetry to the commoners, to the masses, to the society, because he knew it very well that he was not talking about any theory of poetry. You got to believe me. He was some of the people say that it is a reaction against the pseudo-classical theory of poetic diction. But it was not actually the same. On the first go, you may take it that way, but you have to consider that the poet's only desire here was a desire to find a suitable language for the new territory of human life. This was a new territory of human life. Why? Because it was coming from rustic and humble life. It was the themes of the poetry of William Wordsworth were taken from common life. Some minor incidents, very casual situations happening to everyone, they became the themes of the poetry of William Wordsworth. So this was actually the simplicity of the theme the poet was concerned here, right? And that is why he thought that there was a requirement of introducing his poetry to the people, because how they would take it, it won't be easy for these people to break down the shackles of neoclassical tradition all of a sudden. And that was the sole responsibility on the part of the poet, that he should introduce his poetry to the people of the world. And that's the sole reason why he wrote this preface. That was the purpose of his preface. Okay. Now, when he talks about a poet is essentially man speaking to men, he is talking about layman's language here. Okay. There is actually the aim of the poet is to give pleasure. That's the sole idea when he talks about essentially a man speaking to men. A poet is essentially a man speaking to men. What is the difference between a poet and a commoner then? There is, of course, a very important, difference between a poet and the commoners like you and me. Actually, William Wordsworth emphasizes the social function of poetry here. Okay. A poet differs from ordinary man, according to Wordsworth, which he states in his preface. He says, a poet differs from ordinary man, not in nature, but in degree. His imagination is greater than commoners, right? These are the qualifications of a poet. When he talks about this kind of a definition of a poet, essentially a man speaking to men, the poet here is talking about, the poet William Wordsworth is talking about the difference between a poet and a common lot. What is the difference between these two? Of course, the poet stands out of common lot in terms of greater sensibilities, right? In terms of more comprehensive soul, in terms of greater power of imagination, in terms of greater power of communication. Now, if it is so, if these are the qualifications of the poet, then of course the poet is standing out of the common lot. This is how he tries to consider the qualification of a poet, though he says that the poet is essentially a man speaking to men. At the same time, he must be having little, what should I say? He must have, in degree of imagination, communication, comprehensiveness. He should be little, qualified comparatively as compared to the common lot. He should be a little uplifted. He should be elevated in terms of his flight of imagination, in terms of his sensibilities, in terms of his imagination, in terms of his communication. And that's how he talks about poetry as the most philosophical of all writings. According to William Wordsworth, when he talks about the poet and poetry, he says poetry is the most philosophical of all writings. When he talks about theory of poetic language, he says meter is, a good poet is, of course, essentially a man speaking to men, but at the same time, he must have little elevated powers in terms of imagination. He must have the comprehensive soul. He must have greater sensibilities. He must have a perfect blend of communicating between the subject and the object. Okay, that should be the idea of a good poet. Now, what is the aim of the good poet? What is the aim of a poet? According to William Wordsworth, he says a good poet is to give pleasure. You see, a good poet has the job to, give pleasure. According to this idea, or this, the poet's aim, what is meant by giving pleasure? Don't forget, the ancient regime was about to be collapsing in the hands of William Wordsworth. When he talks about rustic language, when he talks about poetic language, when he talks about the language of the commoners, picked up from the common life, he says that to give pleasure. Now, but this language used by the rustics, okay, commoners, shepherds, these should not be used as it is. I mean, this should not be invested as it is, which has been spoken by the rustics. Why? Because there is this danger of getting this language, worst, not dignified, or it would be coarse, it would be disgustful. And that is why William Wordsworth says that this language which has been used by the rustics or the shepherds or the commoners is to be needed to be purified. Now, when this language is needed to be purified, what is it that is to be selected? The selection should come at will by the poet, okay? The poet should select this language, and this language should be purified, and then this language is to be utilized through the poetry of this, the poet. That is how he talks about giving pleasure. This should be the aim of the poet. So the language used by the commoners is not to be as it is utilized, as it is invested in the poetry of William Wordsworth. He says, no, 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 no. This should not happen. In fact, it should be purified. How it is to be purified? It should be selected. It should be properly, purified, modified, so that it should give pleasure. That is the aim of the poet. Poetry, later on, he says, there is the use of meter there. That should be very important. The poet should use meter. Though it is the fact propagated, what should I say? Critically acclaimed by William Wordsworth. At the same time, the poet says that there is no essential difference between the language of prose and the language of poetry, because both these, forms use words. And here he talks about the use of meter. According to William Wordsworth, he says, meter is super added. Not my words. He says meter is super added. It gives pleasure when it is, the language of the poem gives pleasure when it is infused with meter. Meter is a prerequisite according to William Wordsworth. According to William Wordsworth, meter is the prerequisite of writing poetry, because it is something which is regular and uniform. For William Wordsworth, it is something which is regular and uniform, while poetic diction is arbitrary and capricious. In fact, poetic diction was critically criticized by William Wordsworth in his Preface to Lyrical Ballads, because poetic diction was quite liberally used by neoclassicals or Augustan poets, and he wanted to break away from this tradition, and that is why he criticizes poetic diction, and he says that this is I would take up exact wordings from Preface to Lyrical Ballads, which are used by Wordsworth here. Wordsworth says the gaudiness and phraseology of poetic diction is to be avoided on the part of the poet. Who is a good poet? Ultimately, a poet who avoids, very ornamental language. He doesn't justify the use of ornamental language, figures of speech invested by the poet. According to William Wordsworth, there is absolutely no reason for this, superficial language or artificial language, which has been invested by the tradition of neoclassicals or Augustan pseudo-classicals, okay? So a good poet should speak the language of the commoners, okay? He should speak, he should use simple language which has been spoken by the rustics, though it would be purified, and the use of meter is to be invested, because this poetic diction, if we talk about poetic diction, it is merely gaudiness infused and phraseology. When you use poetic diction in your poetry, it becomes gaudy and it becomes merely, verbatos. And that was here the poet William Wordsworth is justifying the use of meter here. He says it's an additional source of pleasure. If you invest meter in your poetry, it adds to the addition. It adds to the pleasure sorter. Okay, and that is why meter is to be used. Right? It can give pleasure even when language is simple. If you keep writing in metrical form, your poetry, okay, that would definitely give additional pleasure, though it would be simple in language. Even if language is simple in your poetry, if you write your poems in metrical form, it would add more pleasure to it. That's how he justifies meter. Then he says it has tempering and restraining effect on the flow of emotions. It tempers and softens the painful and the pathetic. If there is painful emotion in the poem, if it is very pathetic, very poor in terms of theme of the poem, if you add meter, it would definitely restrain the effect of that flow of emotion, and it would definitely soften the emotion of painfulness. That's the sole reason there is a requirement of meter in the poetry of the poets, according to William Wordsworth. He says meter imparts passion to the words. Okay, so the words of the poem are impregnated with passion. If you invest meter in your poetry, it heightens the emotional intensity as well. So emotional intensity is to be heightened up if you write your poems in metrical form, in meter. Okay, that was the idea which was argued in the preface by William Wordsworth, talking about one of the very important definitions of poetry. We are heading towards that part of the lecture now. Okay, now why there was the requirement of rustic and humble life, and why to choose the themes all taken up from the incidents and situations from common life? Because in common life, according to the poet, simplicity is on the top, okay, of the world. Simple life is very important for the poet William Wordsworth. Do not forget, he is the Lake District poet. He was born and brought up in the Lake District of Cumberland, right? And naturally, nature was his best companion. Now, if it is so, if this is the reality of the upbringing of the poet, we have to consider that, of course, simplicity was at the backbone, was the backbone of the poetry produced by William Wordsworth. So simplicity, highly emotional and passionate feelings which flow down the lives of commoners, that was highlighted by the poet when he talks about the humble and rustic life. Okay, essential, according to the poet, what happens here when he picks up the themes and the ideas, incidents, events from the common life. According to the poet William Wordsworth, he says, essential truths about human life and nature can be more easily communicated. If we talk about common life, if we talk about why to pick up these incidents and situations from common life as the themes of the poems of William Wordsworth, he believed that essential truths about human life and nature can be more easily communicated through these themes. And that's the best example one can cite here, none other than lines written above, few miles above Tinton Abbey, okay, wherein essential truths about human life are brilliantly communicated and conveyed easily by the poet. Now, nature, in terms of human nature, the poet is talking about as a subject, and the object is, of course, the natural, elements which are fused, which are having lasting impression on the mind of the poet. Both the things the poet is talking about, the blend of these two into one, okay, and this is the comprehensive soul of the poet. The poet is talking about that here. The poet is talking about subject and object fused in such a way that they become one, and this is to be communicated through his poetic language, okay, to the community, to the society, so that it would seek heightened pleasure. That was the idea, and that's why he advocated the use of meter here. Now, coming to the last segment of one of the very crucial discussions so far justified by William Wordsworth in his preface. He talks about the process of creation here through this definition. One of the very famous definitions of poems in the world. There are so many poets who have defined poem according to their own way of looking at the things. Okay. Now, here the poet William Wordsworth is talking about one of the very famous definitions, wherein he says, poetry, according to him, is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings originated in the internal feelings of the poet. Okay? This is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings, recollected in tranquility. It must flow out naturally and smoothly from the soul of the poet. Now, a good poet must ponder over such powerful emotions. The poet William Wordsworth does not justify the immediate, or you may say the immediate, creation of the poem. As soon as you stuck up with the emotion, as soon as your heart is filled with the emotions of a particular incident, a particular event, if the poet starts writing and on the spur of the moment, that poet is not called as the good poet by William Wordsworth. William Wordsworth says a good poet has to ponder over, okay? He must ponder over. Let this be at the subconscious mind of the poet, left there dormant for months together, days together, years together. And when he comes across the same incident in the future, if he visits the same incident in the future, if he is, finding similarities, if that particular emotion strikes his past emotion, which is, in the residues of his memories, okay, then he should ponder over such powerful emotions long and deeply. I am exactly picking from the words taken up from Preface by William Wordsworth. He should wait. He should ponder over. He should, keep pondering long and deeply. Then it originates from emotions recollected in tranquility, giving it a novelty. Okay. That is what exactly is argued by William Wordsworth when he talks about this definition. Not only this is an argument on the part of the poet William Wordsworth, but he also talks about his process of poetic creation through this definition. You see, poetry is a spontaneous overflow. The poet is talking about 4 important stages here. First of all, first stage is observation. Okay. It is a perception of some object or some character which is to be considered here, right? Or the incident we are talking about, right? It should be observed. It should be perceived. The perception should take place in the mind of the poet, which sets up powerful emotions in the mind of the poet. For example, daffodils, if we talk about, the very perception of the dancing daffodils on the tune of breeze, yellow-colored flowers, okay, that sets up the powerful feelings in the mind of the poet. That is the first stage, observation, perception, okay. Secondly, the poet talks about spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings, okay. Recollection. The poet needs to contemplate. That's the second stage. He should reflect, he should recollect, he should contemplate of that particular emotion is to be contemplated properly in tranquility. That's the key word here. It's very important. It should be in tranquility. Okay. This should be the memory, which should be given full weightage here. Memory is the vital character here, which would play the very crucial role here. Okay, memory plays a vital role here, right? That the poet should contemplate on that particular emotion in tranquility. Poetry, I repeat, poetry is spontaneous overflow of powerful emotions recollected in tranquility. They should have contemplation on the part of the poet so that he would understand that emotion. His heart would be filled with that emotion. That poetic intensity will be aroused in the mind and the heart of the poet, okay, through contemplation, so that till his passions feel anew. I mean, the passions are brought anew. There comes a novelty to those passions now, right? And the third important stage of this poetic creation, poetic composition, is that filtration is very, very important. Not every emotion which is kept in the memory of a poet is given weightage through his poetry. No, 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 no. There are some purgations which are to be taken place, which are to be considered seriously on the part of the poet, okay? There is a requirement of purging of non-essential elements, which are not essential, which are non-essential. They are to be purgated, they are to be removed, thus making his experience communicated to all. This experience is to be communicable, okay? And this would be communicable when the poet goes through filtration of unimportant emotions, non-essential elements, which are to be removed from that particular intense emotion, that particular intense passion, which is talked about in this definition by William Wordsworth, when he talks about poetry is spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings recollected in tranquility. Third stage is quite important. Not all incidents, not all, what should I say, perceptions are given weightage through the poetry of a poet. No, no, no. There needs filtration on the part of the poet. There should be the passions which are anew, which would give novelty. And if it is to be given novelty, this passion is to be, this passion should go through filtration process. That particular passion would remain at the heart and the mind of the poet, which is utterly passionate, which is intense in emotions, in feelings. The poet's heart is filled with this intense emotion, and there is the outburst of that emotion. Now it is that the poet is ready now to have his poetic composition given expression through his poetry. And the last stage of this process is composition. Actual composition takes place. It begins and it becomes, now the poet is ready. The poet becomes a man speaking to men. Now you may understand what I was talking about. Now here you find that the last two important stages, first is contemplation in tranquility, is badly required on the part of the poet, so that he would, revisit those past memories, okay? The past memories would be revived, rejuvenated, but it's not all, all the memories will not be given weightage in the poetic composition, poetic expression of the poet on the part of the poet. There is a requirement of the third stage, and this third stage is filtration. There is a requirement of filtration of unnecessary, non-essential elements, so that now the poet is ready to communicate what exactly he wants to be communicated, okay? He becomes one with the commoners through this process. And there you find that we are coming to the last part of the poet's definition here, when we talk about poetic creation on the part of the poet. Okay. Now, coming back to one of the very famous definitions of Wordsworth's poetry, according to Wordsworth, a poem is a spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings recollected in tranquility. Okay. If you remember lines written a few miles away from Tintern Abbey, that poem, you would find that this exactly is the process the poet is talking about. Okay. This was the second visit when he revisited. At that time, there was his sister Dorothy accompanying him, and the previous meeting is revisited through the second visit by the poet to Tintern Abbey, and later on he contemplates. It's not at the spur of the moment of the second visit the poet has written that poem. Believe me, he keeps thinking about in tranquility the past memories which came up on the forefront of the mind of the poet, on the heart of the poet. They are not given full weightage, completely giving, all the memories are not given weightage, but they are purged, they are filtered, and those intense emotions, those intense feelings which are still, knocking at the door of the poet's heart and mind, they are given full weightage. Now the poet is ready to compose his poem, and this is nothing but communicating. Man, essentially a man communicating, speaking to men in collectively, okay, at large, right? So here with this, some of the very crucial points of discussion I try to cover up through my first part of the lecture, which comes to an end through this kind of a deliberation, which I tried to justify when it comes to Preface to Lyrical Ballads by William Wordsworth. Believe me, it was not a poetic theory or poetic language the poet was talking about. He was simply trying to have the desire to try to understand, to let the readers understand what he means by poetic language, what he means by simplicity, what he means by a good poet, what he means by the use of meter, what he means by writing poems not to instruct but to give pleasure. And if this pleasure is to be communicated through intense pleasure, one has to go through meter. One has to have the pen inked in meter, okay, to compose the poem. So this is all about my first part of the lecture. When we talk about the preface to Lyrical Ballads, there was the necessity actually on the part of the poet. You got to consider one of the very important issues when they William Wordsworth and Coleridge, when we talk about William Wordsworth and Coleridge, lyrical ballads, they agreed upon two important factors here. When this was a collaborative venture, Lyrical Ballads, first generation romantic poets, William Wordsworth and S.T. Coleridge, they were the good pals, they were the besties, you may say. They were often wanton in the wild poesy, right? And they came up with the idea, they agreed upon writing two sets of poems to be published through Lyrical Ballads. In the one, the incidents, mark my words, the incidents and agents to be in part at least supernatural, okay? Incidents and agents to be in part at least supernatural. And in the second case, subjects were to be chosen from ordinary life, but were to be given the charm of novelty. I mean, I'm talking about the first part of my lecture, which I discussed right before the moments. I was talking about the second case. Subjects were to be chosen from ordinary lives, okay, but with the charm of novelty, which was considered by William Wordsworth, okay. Now, when we talk about second important poet, second important set of poems, which is talking about the incidents and agents to be in part at least supernatural. We are heading towards St. Coleridge, right? Now, this was how they agreed upon. Lyrical ballads was to be split into two sets of poems, okay? One was taken up by William Wordsworth, that the incidents and the events would be taken from ordinary lives, but having the charm of novelty. Rustics, the language, poetic language would be very common. Simplicity would be on the top. Okay, individuality will be given weightage. Imagination will be the supreme concern. All the characteristics of romantic age, for that matter, were kept in mind by William Wordsworth and St. Coleridge. But when it comes to the second part, the second set of themes, which was to be considered by St. Coleridge, we are talking about supernatural. Now, this supernatural was to be considered, okay? But when preface to lyrical ballads, in fact, St. Coleridge believes that preface to lyrical ballads is half of his brainchild, okay? That was previously agreed upon by St. Coleridge. He said that half of the part of the preface was his own brainchild. They discussed together and they they agreed upon that there was a requirement of introduction to their poetry because it was breaking the shackles of ancient regime, okay? And when Wordsworth kept revising preface to lyrical ballads, some of the points of discussion, elaboration, critical discourse, which was put forth by William Wordsworth, later on St. Coleridge did not agree upon. For example, the use of, the statement wherein the poet William Wordsworth says that the language of prose and poetry are essentially same. This was argued upon and highly criticized by St. Coleridge, right, in his Biographia Literaria. This was a point of disagreement here. Mostly when we talk about St. Coleridge and his Biographia Literaria, do not forget some of the great critics of the world treat St. Coleridge they place St. Coleridge in line with Aristotle, Longinus, and Coleridge. But T.S. Eliot disagrees, and he says that it was pretty lethargic kind of commentary on the part of St. Coleridge when he talks about Biographia Literaria. Coleridge was to make the supernatural second set of poetry in lyrical ballads we are talking about, okay? Coleridge was to make the supernatural appear credible, okay? Thus, with the help of natural, will be dealt supernaturally by the poet, and the reader will comprehend it with willing suspension of disbelief. That I will be coming to the same point quite in detail in my later moments of the lecture. Coming back to Coleridge, Biographia Literaria was written in 1815 and it got published in 1817. This is treated to be the greatest book of criticism. In fact, Sainsbury, one of the very famous critics of the world, calls it the Bible of criticism. I mean, he has given St. Coleridge beyond imagination, he has put S.T. Coleridge on the top of the realm of criticism, saying this Biographia Literaria as the Bible of criticism. I mean, this is quite a wonderful compliment, a great compliment given to S.T. Coleridge. And believe me, partially we do agree upon when Sainsbury, says that this is a Bible of criticism. We do agree with Sainsbury because till date, nobody has talked about, nobody has, given such a very streamlined and disciplined argument about the concept of imagination, which has been dealt by S.T. Coleridge through this book, Biographia, through this critical discourse, Biographia Literaria in 1817. Okay. Now, 1815, he wrote this book, but he got it published in 1817. Right? This book is in 2 volumes, and more than 20 chapters are invested. To be very exact, there are 23 chapters in Biographia Literaria, right? But talking about Biographia Literaria, this is called as Biographia Literaria. Previously, it used to be called as Autobiographia Literaria by S.T. Coleridge, okay? And later he changed this. It was also from his autobiographical sketches and all, these were the titles which he considered. Anyway, coming back to Biographia Literaria, S.T. Coleridge seems to have adopted existentialism, and he talks about Freud here as well. These were the influences when we talk about S.T. Coleridge, okay? Talking about S.T. Coleridge and his Biographia Literaria, you can easily observe one of the very important influences which were there at the back of the mind of S.T. Coleridge was none other than William Wordsworth. I mean, though they were the pals, they were the collaborators, okay? William Wordsworth was having lasting impression on the mind of S.T. Coleridge. Of course, they disagreed upon some very pertinent issues which were delineated by William Wordsworth in Preface, but still, William Wordsworth is, of course, one of the very great influences on the mind of S.T. Coleridge. Previously, this book was not actually received properly, okay? It was highly criticized. It was highly, condemned by most of the critics of the world. But this happens when we look at other critical discourses or other critical arguments by the critics like Aristotle, by the critics like T.S. Eliot for that matter. Every critic has been criticized. Every critical argument has been criticized by some other critics in the world, right? What exactly is the major theme of Biographia Literaria here is that Biographia Literaria discusses elements of writing, okay? It discusses elements of writing and what writing should be considered genius. Which writing will be called as genius, and what are the elements of writing? These are the major themes of Biographia Literaria. I'm talking about those chapters which are prescribed for the syllabus of RTMNU PG, third sem syllabus. Okay, so according to these chapters which are given for the syllabus, for the study material of the third sem students, I have jotted down some very pertinent issues and themes of Biographia Literaria, keeping in view these chapters. Here the critic S.T. Coleridge is talking about the elements of writing, okay? He discusses about the elements of writing, and at the same time he talks about what is to be called as a genius writing, okay? Which writing is considered to be the writing of a genius. he discusses many variables that influence and inspire writers as well. Okay. The assumptions that the mind is a tabula rasa, okay, on which external experiences, sense, impressions were imprinted, stored, recalled, and combined through a process of association, were completely rejected by S.T. Coleridge. The idea of empiricist, empiricist's way of looking at the things, assumptions that the mind is a tabula rasa, was completely shunned by S.T. Coleridge through this Biographia Literaria. In fact, Coleridge divided the mind into two distinct faculties. Okay, according to S.T. Coleridge, he is not talking about the mind as tabula rasa, which is, capturing on which external experiences, sense impressions were imprinted. In fact, he distinguishes, he divides mind into two distinct categories, faculties. One is imagination and the other one is fancy, right? So the practical application of these principles, once established to the poetical theory of Wordsworth, were also discussed by the poet. The fourth chapter of Biographia Literaria is talking about his influence in terms of Wordsworth. Okay, in the fourth chapter of Biographia Literaria, he's talking about Wordsworth's influence on S.T. Coleridge, right? And in chapter 13 and 14, most of the times, all over the world, those who are the people of literature, the lovers of literature, the students of literature, they believe that chapter 13 and 14, they are the most complex chapters in the write-up of Biographia Literaria. Chapter 13, it deals with the idea of poetic creation, the concept of imagination and fancy. Now, Coleridge rules out the assumptions from Horace onwards, okay? And what is that? That the function of poetry is to instruct. On the contrary, it is to give immediate pleasure. What is the idea of a poem? According to S.T. Coleridge, what is the function of poetry? According to S.T. Coleridge, what he propagates, what he idealizes, or what he argues in Biographia Literaria, he says that the function of poetry is not to instruct, okay? In fact, it should give immediate pleasure through the medium of beauty. That is exactly taken from the words of S.T. Coleridge uttered in Biographia Literaria. So the idea of the function of a poetry is not to instruct the society or the people, but to give immediate pleasure. And how it is to be given immediate pleasure? It should be through the medium of beauty. Thus, his theory of imagination, through his theory of imagination, you may say that he revolutionized the concept of artistic imitation, okay? Through the idea of imagination, through the concept of imagination, through the theory of imagination, the poet has revolutionized the concept of artistic imitation. Do not forget, he had to talk about supernatural elements, okay? And through the flight of imagination, artistic imitation takes place, okay? Poetry is not imitation for S.T. Coleridge. In fact, for S.T. Coleridge, poetry is creation based on sensations and impressions received from external world, modified, okay, diffused, dissipated in order to recreate, right? That exactly we have to focus on this kind of a important issue which has been discussed in Biographia Literaria by S.T. Coleridge. He says, according to S.T. Coleridge, in fact, he calls imagination as a symplastic, element for S.T. Coleridge. Imagination is having synthesizing power. Okay. Now, imagination is given much weightage by S.T. Coleridge through his idea of imagination or the theory of imagination. He believes that there are two types of imagination. Okay. First is primary imagination, and the second one is secondary imagination. Primary imagination is what it is inborn. It is everywhere. It is with you. It is with me. All of us are having primary imagination, but all of us are not poets, that's for sure. What is the reason behind it? Because primary imagination is everywhere. It is found everywhere. It is inborn. It is with you. It is in me. Okay. It is a common faculty among all of us, having residues of our subconscious mind. It's there at the subconscious mind. Everything that is perceived, seen by us, by the faculties, are called as primary imagination. Okay. It does not recreate. It does not recreate, but perceives and captures. It is just like the camera. Okay. Primary imagination can be called as the camera, right? This camera captures each and everything, whichever is perceived, whichever is visited, whichever is seen through the faculties of senses, okay? Different senses, which we often invest in, right? But primary imagination cannot recreate. It just perceives the things which are happening in front of us, perceives the things which are seen by us, right? Primary imagination functions as a repetition in the finite mind of human beings, of the eternal act of creation in the infinite. Primary imagination with God. I am, okay? So this subject, I am, is having generative quality. It is continuity of primary imagination that makes it indefinite, infinite, that doesn't extinct. Okay, it's there, it's infinite, it's always there in the finite mind. This is finite mind. Being the mortal being, we are having finite mind. Okay, now in this finite mind, what happens? Eternal act of creation in the infinite I am. Now this is exactly the job or the function of primary imagination. Perceived is to be stored in the finite mind, right? And this of the eternal act of creation in the infinite I am. Now this infinite I am is nature. Okay, so what is to be done when we talk about the function of primary imagination? Primary imagination is nothing but the that particular repetition in the finite mind, which is of the eternal act of creating infinite I am. It is a generative quality observed everywhere in every one of us, right? It is the continuity of primary imagination that makes it infinite, that doesn't extinct. We keep perceiving the things. I mean, there is no limit to that. It is infinite, which does not extinct, but what is it? It is the repetition in the finite mind. Here. as a mortal being, we have got finite mind, but the infinite keeps going on. In fact, primary imagination makes it infinite because it doesn't extinct. It is there at the subconscious mind of the human beings. That is the job, that is the function of primary imagination, which is found everywhere. Okay. Now, a poem is, when we talk about a general faculty available in all human beings, we are talking about primary imagination, which does not extinct. It is a general faculty which is there with you, which is there with me. But how about secondary imagination? Secondary imagination is, of course, poetic imagination. It is uncommon faculty. It's not inborn, but it is achieved. Okay, doesn't differ from PI, that is primary imagination, in kind but in degree. For example, you are having primary imagination, everybody is having primary imagination, including me. But here, I may not be having secondary imagination because it is not different than primary imagination, but the degree is varying. You know, if the degree of primary imagination is extremely high, I would be having poetic imagination. My imagination, my flight of imagination will be completely different than the commoner's flight of imagination. Why? Because it would be in degree varying, it would be in degree high. Okay, much elevated, quite high in degree. So secondary imagination is actually poetic imagination. This is how S.T. Coleridge tries to differentiate a poet from the common lot. What is the difference between a poet and the common lot? A poet is the owner of secondary imagination. Of course, primary imagination inbuilt, okay? But he has got secondary imagination, whereas the common lot may not have secondary imagination. That supreme flight of imagination is missing in the common lot, okay? And that is why the poet differs from rest of the masses. Secondary imagination is the poetic imagination, okay? Now, it is uncommon faculty, it's not inborn. It does not differ from primary imagination in kind, but in degree. Not different in kind, but in degree in human beings. This is the higher level of primary imagination we are discussing here, okay? So it elevates the part of primary imagination in such a way that it becomes secondary imagination. Do not forget, secondary imagination is already has already have primary imagination, okay? It will not exclude primary imagination. It's inbuilt, okay? But it is primary imagination is little elevated to that particular level, which becomes secondary imagination. It coexists with conscious mind. So subconscious mind and conscious mind are coexisting in secondary imagination, so that that particular individual is ready to proceed for poetic composition. There will be, he would be quite talented in producing poetic compositions through this conscious creation. Of course, it is the conscious creation on the part of the secondary imagination holder, the owner of secondary imagination. On the part of this poet, this is the conscious creation. For T.S. Eliot, he often treats the concept of imagination as the synthesizing power, having synthesizing power, okay? He calls it, isemplastic, right? That is the word he uses. By this imagination of a poet, what he does, he he creates the sensations, he creates the impressions received from external world, he modifies them, and by the flight of that poet's imagination, the poetic creation takes place. This is what is called as conscious creation. But for that, what is required is the secondary imagination. A poem is an organic whole having meter and rhyme. Okay, I will come back to this issue in the last segment of my lecture. Let me finish this concept of imagination, which is completely distinct than fancy, according to the poet critic S.T. Coleridge. For the first time in the history of literary criticism, he has conceptualized imagination, that these are the two distinct faculties of mind. He desynonymizes these two, okay, imagination and fancy. Most of the times, before the write-up of S.T. Coleridge took place, people or the critics and the poets of the world, they believed that fancy and imagination were synonymous to each other. But S.T. Coleridge says no to this. In fact, he tries to, de-synonymize imagination and fancy. According to the poet critic, the pleasure which is talked about, sought from, okay, to be sought from, is the true pleasure. So immediate goal of the poem is to get immediate pleasure. That is the immediate pleasure the poet is talking about. But in the long run, what is to be the function of poetry? The function of poetry is to give true pleasure. So immediate goal of the poem is to seek immediate pleasure, but true pleasure would be sought because the poem is the organic whole, and then he talks about asemplastic power of union of emotion as well as thought when he talks about the concept of imagination. Imagination is asemplastic, okay. When we talk about asemplastic, this is a Greek word which has been taken up by S.T. Coleridge, wherein he talks about the union of emotion and thought, okay. They are united together, emotion and thought. This distinction is, of course, given quite importance to the chapter 13, where he talks about this conception theory of imagination. Now, when we talk about secondary imagination, it is described as a power that dissolves, diffuses, and dissipates objects we see in order to recreate, okay. Now, secondary imagination dissolves, diffuses, and dissipates. What do you mean by this? Presumably, I would say that it dissolves the original union of subject and object, okay. Original union of subject and object effected by the primary imagination. That may be the meaning of, dissolving, diffusing, and dissipating, right? Whatever is affected by the primary imagination, that has been dissolved, diffused, dissipated. That means subject and object by the primary imagination are diffused, okay, dissipated, dissolved in order to recreate, right? So imagination is blending man and nature in modified adjuncts, okay. These are the things which are to be considered very seriously here. In secondary imagination, what happens? Through the flight of imagination, the blending of man, subject and object, blending of man and nature takes place in such a modified way that it recreates, okay? It recreates the world of spirit and matter. That bridges the gap between the spirit and matter. So this is the function of secondary imagination. Imaginative writing is characterized by its seamless fusion. That's very important. Seamless fusion of perception, intellect, feeling, memory, association, and language. In fact, it is nothing but synthesizing the power of imagination, which we are trying to understand through secondary imagination. Why secondary imagination is always there in the heart and the mind of the poet, or the poet is the person who has got secondary imagination, because what happens? Imaginative writing is characterized by its seamless fusion of perception, primary imagination, okay, intellect, feeling, memory, and association through language. Poetry is an activity of the poet's mind, according to S.T. Coleridge. And that's why it is a sensible creation, known or conscious creation. If you remember the previous slide, okay, it's a conscious creation. Why? Because poetry is an activity of the poet's mind. A poem is a verbal form of that activity. Poetry brings the whole soul of man into activity, and that is why through the power or the flight of imagination, it fuses the perception, intellect, memory, association, the subject and object in order to recreate. Now, for the first time, the poet has tried to give weightage to differentiating fancy from imagination. Fancy cannot be distinguished equal or synonymous with imagination, according to S.T. Coleridge. He says fancy does not recreate. According to S.T. Coleridge, fancy does not recreate. It is a form of memory only. It is a kind of storehouse, a mode of memory receiving all its materials ready-made from the law of association. Fancy differs in kind, not in degree. Just like primary, opposite to primary imagination and secondary imagination, which they are same in kind but varying in degrees. Okay, here you find that they are varying in kind. Okay, they are not varying in degree, but the kind itself is different. When we talk about fancy, it is nothing but a kind of fusing two different objects carrying their characteristics intact. I would like to give you an example. Fancy, how it is different than imagination. Okay, in imagination, what do? It is the power of power that dissolves, diffuses, and dissipates in order to recreate. Fancy cannot recreate. Fancy is not at all poetic. In other words, you take the example of oil and water. Okay, if you drop few drops of oil onto the surface of water, you will find that the oil keeps its characteristics. It cannot be dissolved in water. These two are different objects carrying their own characteristics intact. That is exactly the job of fancy. Fancy, it is a form of memory, and it carries the objects with their essential basic tenets with it. It cannot diffuse, it cannot dissolve, it cannot dissipate. Whereas, primary imagination and secondary imagination, they dissolve, diffuse, and dissipates in order to recreate. But all in all, according to S.T. Coleridge, these are the three important things which are to be considered when we talk about the poetic creation on the part of the poet. It is a conscious creation. Do not forget, it is the activity of the poet's mind. Poem is verbal form of that activity, actually, which involves fancy, which involves primary imagination and which also involves secondary imagination, then and then only poetry takes place, poetry is shaped. Okay, so it's not the job of a commoner like you and me to write poem. Okay, if we have secondary imagination, then only we may go for producing poems. So chapter 14 deals with the concept of his poetry, and Poets reflects upon Wordsworth's preface to Lyrical Ballads, wherein he disagrees to some very crucial points of disagreement with William Wordsworth. Legitimate poem is that poem which is having perfect unity of form and content. That is called as organic unity. S.T. Coleridge says, what is called as organic unity in a poem, everything is having organically arranged. Okay, it has got unity of form, it has got content as well. According to the form, the content will be organically intact, unified, as well as the form with the content. So it is the organic unity. A poem, a legitimate poem, is nothing but the perfect unity of form and content. Right. When we talk about chapter 14, one of the very important things which we talk about is that the poem is nothing but an organic construct which, unlike of science, proposes for its immediate object pleasure, not truth. Okay. Its immediate object is pleasure. But in the long run, it should have true pleasure. Right? End result of poetry must be didactic, must have good subject, right? A poet, he reinstates his idea of imagination, which we have discussed so far in much length. A poet brings whole soul of humanity into activity through the magical power of imagination. That is through secondary imagination, this activity is triggered up, and the unity of conscious and subconscious mind takes place in the heart and the mind of the poet, so that he starts creating his poetry, right? And then lastly, the poet comes to the last part of his much needed, much important definition. What is required to constitute poetic faith? Okay, what is required to constitute poetic faith is the willing suspension of disbelief. If you remember the poetry produced by S.T. Coleridge, for that matter, we may cite the examples of Rhyme of Ancient Mariner, Kubla Khan, and Christabel. Do not forget the second set of poems which were agreed upon to be written or considered. That was S.T. Coleridge's job. And what was that? To write those incidents in such a way to be credible, to be believed, to be credible on the part of the readers, so that there should be willing suspension of disbelief. Okay, that should take place. Dramatic illusion should take place on the part of the readers. That capacity should be there in the poet to make him realize what is suggested, what is shown to him for that particular moment. Okay, your belief, your disbeliefs should be suspended at will. Okay, that should be the power of the poet. He should be able to create such incidents, such events, such characters through his poetry, though supernatural. Okay, so that whatever is projected through his poetry in front of the readers, that should be agreed upon, that should be accepted wholeheartedly by the readers. That is called as willing suspension of disbelief. Okay, so it should be willingly suspended. Their what should I say, rational mind, their rational thinking should be willingly suspended for a while to give full importance, complete poetic faith, okay, complete poetic pleasure to be sought after. That is what exactly is the end of the chapter 14. Somehow willing suspension of disbelief, though it is the greatest of all the contribution on the part of S.T. Coleridge, other than the concept or the theorizing of the concept of imagination, this was abruptly finished, I mean, not exactly finished, it was left in between. The critic S.T. Coleridge did not give complete weightage to this idea of willing suspension of disbelief. But as the readers of literature, as the lovers of literature, we may seek some clues out of these, this concept, willing suspension of disbelief. You got to believe me that poetry for S.T. Coleridge is philosophical, okay? And when we talk about philosophy, which is wherever you find philosophical ruminations, whether it's music, painting or not, it is treated to be poetry for S.T. Coleridge, right? And in these arts, okay, in art, or through the artist's way of looking at this art, you have to see that, you have to understand that we have to require willing suspension of our beliefs or disbelief, okay, for a while to seek immediate pleasure. That is the power of the poet. Ultimately, he should be, capable, he should be quite capable of letting the readers suspend their abilities to think rationally for a while. Whatever is projected in front of these readers, in front of these commoners who are about to complement that particular piece of art, they should be willing to suspend their either beliefs or disbeliefs. That was called as willing suspension of disbelief, which was actually dramatic illusion, which is to be created by the poet, okay, through the constitution of poetic faith. And if it is succeeded, if the poet succeeds in achieving this, you would say that the poet is a successful person. That's the sole reason why he could fuse credible with incredible, okay, rational with irrational, natural with supernatural through his poetry by S.T. Coleridge. With this, I think I have tried to, cover almost all the important issues which are delineated, critically argued in these two romantic critical discourses by S.T. Coleridge through Biographia Literaria and William Wordsworth through his preface to literary criticism. I hope I have made it quite clear, and I tried to justify in due period of time what is importantly, focused while studying romantic criticism, because it was, these were the poems, lyrical ballads, in collaboration with S.T. Coleridge. Wordsworth was trying to, go way apart from opposite, in opposite direction. He wanted to break the shackles of ancient regime. Feudal system was already gone, but then individuality was to be given weightage. Rustic life was to be given weightage, wherein the innocent, primary instincts of human feelings are on the top priority. That's the sole reason why there was a requirement of these two discourses or these two critical arguments. They had to go for it. Okay, so critical literary criticism, which was invested by William Wordsworth, and the theory, later on, which was compounded or which was propagated by S.T. Coleridge, keeping in view Shakespearean studies and the poetry.
5 minutes.
William Wordsworth, we are talking about these two, right? So I think I tried my level best to make it simple for all of you all. With this, I thank the organizing team members here who gave me such a wonderful opportunity to deliver one of my favorite, all-time favorites, poets, not only the poets, but the critics here, none other than William Wordsworth and S.T. Coleridge. Thank you so very much. Thank you so very much for having a patient listening. Thank you. Thank you so very much.
Okay.
Over to you, Kapil sir.
Yeah. Thank you, Savita. I started with the social revolutions that had affected the Romantic revival. She started about, mentioned about Industrial Revolution, American Revolution, and French Revolution, and how it was, how that influenced the literature of the age to react against the classical restraint, and more emphasis was given on reason. Then coming to the poets, to the writers, the poets who have come out with this critical texts about the nature. What we find in lyrical ballads is the nature, qualification, and function of poet and poetry. Then the nature of poetic pleasure, the process of creation, the most famous definition of William Wordsworth, emotions recollected in tranquility. Then his views on meter, and about the theme of poetry, as poetry should be about the rustics and about the common people. The poet is man writing about men. That is what the famous statement goes. After Wordsworth, it was Coleridge's biography literaria, and again poetry and imagination, and difference between imagination and fancy, and imagination of primary imagination and secondary imagination, which are the most important terms when it comes to the study of Romantic poetry. And if it is the definition of poetry given by Wordsworth, for Coleridge, we have the willing suspension of disbelief. That is what he has discussed. Then the poetic diction, also as meter was there in Wordsworth, the poetic diction given by Coleridge. So on behalf of the organizing colleges, I express my gratitude, my appreciation for Madam Savita Deogirkar, Dr. Savita Deogirkar, for sparing this morning for us and presenting a session here for the benefit of the students during these difficult times. So thanks.
Any question, Kapil sir? Are you letting
if
the
you have any questions, students, you can ask her.
I feel I must have made them very bored.
No, what they are doing, the messages are coming. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am. That is what they are receiving. So anyway,
no studies, no
our
confusion.
side as well, from the participating students as well. And I declare that the session is over. And
thank you so very much.
We'll be meeting in the evening session at 5 o'clock.
Thank you so very much, Kapil. Once again, thank you so very much.